January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 08:47 hours. The morning mist clung to the frost-bitten pines like shrouds, and the air carried the metallic scent of diesel fuel mixed with the sharp bite of winter cold. Inside the steel belly of Panzer IV No. 432, Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner pressed his eye to the periscope, scanning the tree line ahead. The rhythmic rumble of the Maybach engine beneath him had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over these past weeks of desperate advance. Through the narrow vision port, he could see his breath forming small clouds in the cramped turret, each exhalation a reminder that he was still alive in this frozen hell the Wehrmacht had optimistically called Operation Nordwind. The tank's radio crackled with static-filled German voices, coordinating the morning's advance. Brenner's commander, Hauptmann Weber, had assured them that American air support would be minimal. The weather had been their ally, keeping the dreaded Yabos grounded for nearly a week. The thick overcast had been a blessing, a gray blanket that allowed German armor to move with something approaching the confidence they had once known in the early days of the war. But now, as 0900 approached, Brenner noticed something that made his stomach tighten with a familiar dread. The clouds were beginning to break apart, revealing patches of pale winter sky like wounds in the heavens above. What Brenner and thousands of other German Panzer crewmen had learned over the grinding months of 1944 would soon be reaffirmed with devastating clarity. In this war, the sky had become more dangerous than any Sherman tank, more lethal than any Soviet T-34. More feared than the artillery barrages that had shattered so many of their comrades. The Americans had turned the heavens themselves into a weapon, and their instrument of divine retribution bore the name Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. By January 1945, the German Panzerwaffe faced a reality that would have seemed impossible to the confident tank crews who had rolled across Poland in September 1939. The same men who had once terrorized European battlefields with their superior armor and tactical doctrine now found themselves prey, not to enemy tanks in honest combat, but to machines that struck from above with the fury of modern. Their Panzer IIIs and IVs had crushed French resistance in 6 weeks. Their Tiger tanks had become legends of invincibility on the Eastern Front, and even the mention of their approach could cause enemy formations to retreat. The Luftwaffe had provided air cover, and the Wehrmacht's combined arms doctrine had made German armored divisions the most feared fighting force on earth. But by 1943, that world had begun to crumble from above. American industrial might had unleashed a torrent of aircraft into European skies, and among them, none was more feared by German tank crews than the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. This was not the sleek, elegant fighter that populated recruitment posters. The Thunderbolt was a brute, a 7-ton monster powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine that could drive the aircraft to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, while carrying an external load that would have impressed heavy bomber crews. 8 50 caliber machine guns were built into its wings, each capable of firing 850 rounds per minute. But it was what the Thunderbolt could carry beneath its belly and wings that transformed it from fighter to tank killer. 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each with a warhead capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor plate. A single 500-pound bomb that could flip a Tiger tank like a child's toy. Or, most terrifyingly of all, napalm canisters that could turn the interior of any armored vehicle into an inferno that no amount of Krupp steel could contain. The Americans had taken their philosophy of abundance, more steel, more fuel, more ordnance than any rational military doctrine required, and applied it to the systematic destruction of German armor from above. Hauptgefreiter Heinrich Müller of the 12th SS Panzer Division would later write in his diary, recovered from the wreckage of his Panther tank near Caen, "We no longer fear the Shermans, or even the new Cromwells. We fear the sound they make. that growing thunder that means the Yabos are coming. When you hear that sound, you know that someone in your platoon will not see the sunset. The Americans do not fight with honor. They fight with abundance. This was not the war German tank crews had trained for. In the Panzers, but no instructor had prepared them for an enemy that could appear from any direction at any moment, traveling at speeds that made evasion impossible, and carrying enough ordnance to destroy entire tank companies in a single strafing run. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. Tank crews who had once been the masters of battlefield mobility found themselves afraid to move during daylight hours. Formations that had once advanced with the confidence of conquest now skulked between tree lines, waiting for cloud cover that might never come. The very men who had pioneered blitzkrieg warfare now understood what it meant to be the target of combined arms tactics executed with American precision and abundance. Technical Sergeant Robert Iron Mike Kowalski of the 406th Fighter Group had flown 127 combat missions by the time he encountered the German tank column near Bastogne in January 1945. His P-47D Thunderbolt, named Chicago Thunder after his hometown, carried the scars of flak fragments and enemy fighter encounters, but also the kill markings that told the story of American air power's evolution from defensive to offensive capability. 37 confirmed ground kills were painted beneath his cockpit. Tanks, trucks, locomotives, and gun positions that had fallen to his 8 machine guns, and the rockets that hung beneath his wings like mechanical birds of prey. The Germans, Kowalski would recall in post-war interviews, they were good tankers, real good, but they were fighting the wrong war. They were still thinking about tank versus tank combat, while we were perfecting tank versus sky combat. Every morning we'd get briefings on German armor movements, and every afternoon we'd come back with gun camera footage showing those same tanks burning. It wasn't personal. It was industrial. The industrial nature of American air power was perhaps what German tank crews found most demoralizing. This was not the chivalrous combat of knights in steel chargers that Nazi propaganda had promised. The Americans approached tank destruction with the same methodical efficiency they brought to automobile production. Fighter-bomber squadrons were organized into what pilots called tank-busting flights, formations specifically trained and equipped to identify, and when targets were identified, the flight leader would coordinate a diving attack that brought all 4 aircraft down on the target from different directions simultaneously. The first aircraft would suppress anti-aircraft fire with machine gun strafing. The second and third would deliver rockets or bombs against the heaviest targets, and the fourth would conduct battle damage assessment and re-attack any surviving vehicles. From the perspective of a German tank crew, such an attack was indistinguishable from divine judgment. The first indication of danger would be the growing thunder of Pratt & Whitney engines, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. By the time visual contact was established, the Thunderbolts would already be in their terminal dive, approaching at speeds that made accurate anti-aircraft fire nearly impossible. The attack itself would last perhaps 30 seconds, just long enough for American pilots to deliver ordnance loads that represented months of German industrial production, and then climb back to altitude for the next target. Oberst Heinrich Eberbach, commander of Panzer Lehr Division, documented the psychological transformation of his troops in daily reports that painted a picture of an army learning to fear the sky. 15 January 1945. Lost 6 Panzer IVs to air attack near Saarbrücken. Crews report aircraft appeared without warning despite posted observers. Morale continues to decline. Recommend all movement be restricted to night hours. 2 days later, 17 January 1945. American Jabos destroyed entire 2nd Company during morning advance. No survivors. Remaining crews refused to advance without explicit guarantee of air cover. Luftwaffe promises support. That does not materialize. The Luftwaffe's inability to provide meaningful air cover had transformed German tank crews from hunters into hunted. In 1940, Stukas had cleared the path for German armor across France. By 1945, the sky belonged entirely to the Americans, and German fighters were so few and so overwhelmed that tank crews knew they would fight and die without friendly air support. This knowledge changed everything about how they approached combat, how they planned movements, and ultimately, how they understood their role in the war.
50 caliber ammunition, and could fire continuously for nearly 4 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat, without concerning himself with conservation. The Americans could afford to miss. They could afford to engage marginal targets. They could afford to destroy German tanks with ordnance that cost more than the monthly wages of an entire Wehrmacht battalion. This abundance philosophy extended beyond ammunition to the aircraft themselves. When Technical Sergeant Kowalski's Chicago Thunder was damaged by flak during a tank-busting mission near Luxembourg, he simply flew it back to base, where mechanics replaced the damaged components with parts that had been manufactured in factories thousands of miles away and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean by cargo vessels that traveled in convoys protected by more aircraft than the entire Luftwaffe could put in the sky. Within 12 hours, Kowalski was back in the air, hunting German tanks with a reliability that German crews found both incomprehensible and terrifying. The contrast with German logistics was stark and decisive. When Obergefreiter Brenner's Panzer IV threw a track near Bitburg, his crew spent 3 days waiting for replacement parts that never arrived. The tank was eventually abandoned, its turret removed and emplaced as a static defensive position, another symbol of German armor reduced from mobile striking force to desperate fortification. American aircraft destroyed it 2 weeks later during a routine ground attack mission, the pilot noting in his after-action report that he had expended 47 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition to eliminate what appeared to be an abandoned tank turret. The sound of the P-47's double wasp engine had become the soundtrack of German defeat, a mechanical thunder that announced the arrival of American industrial might in its most concentrated and lethal form. German tank crews developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between the sounds of different aircraft engines. But the Thunderbolt's distinctive rumble was unmistakable and universally feared. Unlike the high-pitched whine of German fighters or the labored drone of bombers, the P-47's engine note was deep and powerful, like distant thunder that grew steadily louder until it became the roar of approaching doom. Psychological studies conducted by Wehrmacht medical officers in late 1944 documented what they termed symptoms included acute sensitivity to aircraft engine sounds, inability to concentrate during daylight hours, and persistent requests for transfer to infantry units that might be less likely to attract air attack. The condition was not recognized by German military psychiatry as a legitimate medical concern, but its prevalence among armored units was undeniable and strategically significant. The Americans, meanwhile, had systematized tank killing into a science. Fighter-bomber pilots attended specialized schools where they learned to identify German armor types by silhouette, to recognize the difference between active and abandoned vehicles, and to coordinate attacks that maximize destruction while minimizing exposure to anti-aircraft fire. Gun camera footage from successful missions was analyzed and used to develop improved tactics, while technical intelligence teams studied the wreckage of destroyed German tanks to understand the effectiveness of different ordnance types against various armor configurations. This scientific approach to tank destruction reflected a broader American philosophy of warfare that emphasized technological solutions over individual heroism. Where German tank crews were trained to rely on skill, experience, and tactical excellence, American pilots were equipped with tools that made success almost inevitable. The P-47's gun sight was a marvel of mechanical engineering, automatically calculating lead angles and range corrections that allowed pilots to achieve hitting percentages that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations of fighter pilots. The aircraft's 8 machine guns were harmonized to create a cone of fire that could disable a tank with a single accurate burst, while the rockets carried beneath its wings could penetrate armor that had been designed to stop the largest anti-tank guns. By early 1945, the transformation was complete. German tank crews who had once been the spearhead of conquest had become the primary targets of American air power, hunted with a methodical persistence that reflected the full weight of American industrial capacity. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be overstated. These were men who had defined themselves as warriors, who had taken pride in mastering the most sophisticated weapons of their era, who had believed in their technological and tactical support. The records of German tank ace Hauptmann Michael Wittmann, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, provide perhaps the most poignant illustration of this transformation. Wittmann had destroyed 138 enemy tanks during his career, making him one of the most successful tank commanders in military history. His tactical brilliance and personal courage had made him a propaganda symbol of German armored superiority. Yet his final radio transmission, recorded by Wehrmacht communications intercept stations on August 8, 1944, consisted of a single, desperate message. "Jabos, Jabos, we are under air attack." Minutes later, his Tiger tank was destroyed by rockets fired from a British Typhoon fighter bomber, ending the career of Germany's most celebrated Panzer ace, not in heroic tank versus tank combat, but in a 30-second air attack that he was powerless to prevent or counter. The symbolic significance of Wittmann's death was not lost on surviving German tank crews. If the Wehrmacht's most skilled and experienced tank commander could be destroyed by air attack, what hope did ordinary crews have? The answer, increasingly, was none. By the winter of 1944-1945, German armored units had effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force during daylight hours. Tank movements were restricted to night operations, when Allied air power was less effective. But this constraint severely limited German tactical options and made coordinated attacks almost impossible. The P-47 Thunderbolt had become more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of American abundance transformed into lethal capability. Each Thunderbolt represented thousands of hours of American labor, tons of American steel, and gallons of American fuel, all dedicated to the single purpose of destroying German tanks. The fact that the United States could produce these aircraft by the thousands, train pilots by the hundreds, and maintain operations across multiple theaters simultaneously demonstrated an industrial capacity that German commanders found incomprehensible. Generalfeldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in Western Europe, captured this sense of overwhelming disadvantage in a conversation with Hitler that was recorded by stenographers in the Führer bunker. "Mein Führer, we are not fighting an army. We are fighting a factory. Every tank we destroy is replaced by..." Unlike German tank crews, who required months of training and years of experience to achieve combat effectiveness, American fighter bomber pilots could be trained to operational standards in a matter of weeks. The aircraft's inherent stability and robust construction made it forgiving of pilot error, while its overwhelming firepower meant that even inexperienced pilots could achieve significant results against ground targets. The contrast was symbolized by the career of Lieutenant James "Skip" Morrison, a 20-year-old pilot from Iowa who had never seen a tank until his first combat mission in December 1944. Within 6 weeks, Morrison had destroyed 12 German armored vehicles, earning him the Distinguished Flying Cross and a promotion to flight leader. His success was not the result of exceptional skill or tactical genius, but rather the product of American abundance, applied through superior technology. Morrison flew a reliable aircraft, carried unlimited ammunition, received regular maintenance, and operated with the support of an intelligence network that provided detailed information about German tank movements. German tank crews, meanwhile, struggled with mechanical problems that often went unrepaired for weeks, ammunition shortages that forced them to choose targets carefully, and intelligence networks that had been largely destroyed by Allied bombing. The material superiority that had once given German armor a decisive advantage had been reversed, and the psychological impact of this reversal was as devastating as the physical destruction inflicted by American air power. The final months of the war saw German tank crews reduced to a state of learned helplessness that would have been unimaginable to the confident warriors who had conquered Poland and France. Tank commanders issued standing orders that crews should abandon their vehicles at the first sound of approaching aircraft, reasoning that trained personnel were more valuable than replaceable equipment. This policy, while rational from a military perspective, completed the psychological transformation of German armor from offensive weapon to liability. Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner survived the war, though his tank did not. On March 15, 1945, near Remagen, Panzer 432 was destroyed by a single rocket fired from a P-47 Thunderbolt flown by Lieutenant Morrison. Brenner and his crew had enough warning to evacuate. In his post-war memoir, published in 1967, Brenner wrote, "We had been taught that tank crews were the elite of the Wehrmacht, the inheritors of a proud tradition that stretched back to the cavalry charges of Frederick the Great. We believed that individual skill and tactical excellence could overcome any material disadvantage. The Americans taught us that abundance, properly applied, could render skill irrelevant. They did not defeat us in combat. They buried us under an avalanche of production." The P-47 Thunderbolt had become the instrument of that avalanche, transforming the sky from neutral territory into American-controlled airspace, where German armor could not survive. The sound of its engine, once merely the mechanical noise of another aircraft, had become the funeral dirge of the Panzerwaffe, announcing the end of an era when German tanks had ruled European battlefields. As the war drew to its inevitable conclusion, the symbolic power of the Thunderbolt extended beyond its tactical effectiveness. It represented a new model of warfare, where industrial capacity mattered more than individual heroism, where abundance could overcome skill, and where technology, properly applied, could render traditional military virtues obsolete. The German tank crews who had once embodied the Wehrmacht's offensive spirit had been reduced to hiding in forests and moving only under cover of darkness, their magnificent machines transformed from weapons of conquest into targets for destruction. The irony was not lost on surviving German veterans. They had pioneered the very combined arms tactics that the Americans had perfected and turned against them. The coordination between air and ground forces that had made blitzkrieg possible in 1940 had been refined and industrialized by their enemies, creating a killing machine of unprecedented efficiency. The Americans had taken German innovation, applied American abundance, and created a system of warfare that made traditional tank combat obsolete. In the end, it was not superior American tanks that defeated the Panzerwaffe. The Sherman was inferior to most German armor in direct combat, and American tank crews often required numerical superiority to achieve victory in ground engagements. It was the realization that tanks, no matter how well armored or powerfully armed, could not fight aircraft that the tank crews who survived the war carried with them the knowledge that military technology had fundamentally changed the nature of armored warfare. No longer could tanks operate as independent striking forces. They required air cover to survive, and air superiority to be effective. The age of tank versus tank combat had ended not with a decisive ground engagement, but with the recognition that the greatest threat to armor came from above. The P-47 Thunderbolt had written the final chapter of the Panzerwaffe's story, transforming German tank crews from predators to prey, and teaching a generation of warriors that in modern warfare, abundance, properly applied, could overcome any amount of individual skill or tactical brilliance. The thunder of its engine had become the sound of American victory, and the silence that followed marked the end of an era when German tanks had dominated European battlefields. In the winter of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed around them, surviving German tank crews understood that they had witnessed more than military defeat. They had seen the future of warfare, where industrial capacity mattered more than martial tradition, where technology could render courage irrelevant, and where the sky itself had become a weapon in the hands of those who possessed the abundance to wield it effectively. The age of the knight in armor had ended, replaced by an era where victory belonged to those who could manufacture it in the greatest quantities and deliver it with the most devastating efficiency. The sound of the P-47's engine, growing from distant thunder to overwhelming roar, had become the soundtrack of that transformation, a mechanical hymn to American abundance that German tank crews would remember for the rest of their lives as the moment when they learned to fear the sky more than any earthly enemy.